Welcome. I'm Rob Wolcott, and this is 3 Billion Seconds, where we explore the future by speaking with people who are creating it. I'm pleased to be here today in Lexington, Kentucky at Alltech One, Alltech Corporation's annual event exploring the future of food and agriculture technology. And with me now is Mary Shelman, someone who's been in the academic field, in the private sector, worked with governments, national governments, to create agriculture policy and businesses all over the world. Mary, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What's your favorite story from your entire career in the ag space? And it doesn't have to have any relevance, and you get points for humor.
Points
Your
for humor.
favorite
Wow.
story?
Probably the one that was most impactful, but not necessarily. So I'll get no points for humor for this. I'll think about that one later.
Okay.
But I was actually out on the Cerrado in Brazil, and I was writing a case study on a technology that Embrapa, the
Yep.
Brazilian National Research Organization,
Who was
had
extraordinary at transforming
Absolutely.
agriculture in Brazil and was
Absolutely.
even working to bring it to some version to Africa.
Africa, exactly, and there's a lot of reasons why that's important. But I was out with looking at this particular process that they were trying to get adopted, which was to a big challenge there was because of the degraded land, because of the cattle that were running on it. And the soils of the Cerrado are very old and they're very thin. So if there's any type, you take the cover off of it, because there's no organic matter, the soil doesn't hold together. So when the rains come, the whole thing just washes and it ends up in the rivers and the gullies and the power plants. And but yet there was also, they figured out how to grow crops on the Cerrado. But the ideal combination was to get crops and cattle on the same land. So they called it an integrated crop management system, where you went in and basically at the same time you planted corn, what they would call maize, corn, and grass seed at the same time. You would plant corn to a certain depth and the grass seed deeper. The corn would come up first and get established. The grass seed would come up behind it. The corn would mature, they would combine it, and there was grass left in the field.
And then they could graze.
And then they grazed.
Immediately
after that. And because there was always a cover crop on it, you never had the erosion. So I was out, with this farmer that was actually trying, and it turned out it was very, very difficult to get them to adopt, because you were either a livestock farmer or you were a crop farmer. And it's complicated to do both. It's very narrow. But we were there, and this, very interesting farmer and his wife was out, and we were talking about, the prospects around agriculture, which I found very exciting. And they had two sons, and I said, well, the farmer was saying, I was asking him about the environment and sustainability, even though we really weren't talking much about sustainability at that time. It was 10 or 11 years ago. And he said, they translated it to farmers are the first environmentalists. And I love that quote, right? But then I turned to his wife and said, well, what are your sons doing now? And they're like, oh, we sent them to the city. One's going to be a lawyer and one's going to be a doctor, because we don't want them to be
This
farmers.
isn't the place to build your future. But what does this say, Mary, about talent? And that is a perfect example of people who could have been taken that path, but for many good reasons decided to take another path. You're an advocate for talent in the ag space.
And I am, because I believe that solved so many problems, the challenges that we talk about in the world today, feeding 9 billion, 10 billion people in 2050, making sure that we have the right concerns about the environment, the right concerns about animal welfare, that we get a technology adopted that helps us with all of that. We can solve all those problems if we get the right people in. But I think traditionally, farming is what the third son did, right? If you had a family, the first son went off and, inherited, the second son joined the church, and the third son, heaven forbid, had to stay on the farm. And because it was considered very low skilled, without great prospects, you work really hard. Still today, most farmers around the world, they work very, very hard. If you're a dairy farmer, 7 days a week, basically almost 24 hours a day.
My grandfather was a dairy farmer in Iowa.
And, so I grew up knowing dairy farmers here. I thought it was the hardest life in the world. And, so no vacation, no sick days. My dad was a farm equipment dealer, So he spent his life servicing those farmers. So it was the same thing for him. That, the times that I was, hoping that he would come to a school function or that we had plans to do something together. But if somebody's, combine broke down in the field, or the planter broke down, or it was cold and the feed mill wouldn't grind,
Right.
then he had to go fix it because
didn't matter what time it was,
Yeah.
he would be there.
Right.
So we have to feed the world.
Right.
We have to feed 9 billion people in the future. How do we get the right talent into the room? What do you do to make that happen?
Well, I think one of the things is the very fundamental things. You have to improve the returns to farming. That's one piece of it. Second piece, the things we can find that make it a little less labor intensive. I think the more exciting piece is when we can actually reposition farming, reposition the entire agricultural sector as what I believe is the most important sector in the world. And I think about the young people today and how they have a tremendous desire to make a difference. Sometimes more of a desire to make a difference than a desire to, fill their bank account or make sure they have a future. But they're
So are
thinking
you
about the
seeing
future
that,
of the
Mary?
world.
Are you seeing that that's real? I mean, some people
Yeah.
say, well, they say that now, but when the reality hits, they're going to become an accountant.
Well, whenever I
Nothing against accountants, of course.
So my son's, 20, almost 26. So his cohort that I've seen come together, and he was that one that followed the, maybe the more traditional path. He was, maybe it's because we were, my advice to him and my advice to other young people that I meet that are out there talking about as they're, getting ready to go into college, graduate college, go into, make some decision, and they want to go and have an impact in it. Like, remember what they tell you on the airplane? If the airplane should lose pressure, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling
first.
and put your own mask on first. So, to me, sustainability, it's personal sustainability is, you need to get yourself on a firm financial situation. But it is true that the values, I think that they have, compared to, I think when I was that age and at that time, exact age that my son is entering Harvard Business School in the MBA class, we didn't think about issues like this. We thought about much simpler issues.
I can attest to the fact that even back in 2001 or so, when I was becoming involved at the Kellogg School of Management, there wasn't that much conversation at the time about sustainability, about the role of business and purpose of business. There were a few people doing it, but they were the sort of those people in Birkenstocks, off to the side, and you left them alone.
Yeah.
But I'm very excited to say, and this is not just at Kellogg, I hear from my friends at other institutions like Harvard, that it's a central topic now.
That's
And
right.
you've got to have serious work going on. You've got to have serious opportunities. And I know that my small firm, Clario, we have 20 people. We hire young people, and they ask the question, so why does this matter? Why does this matter? So how do you tell that story, Mary? Obviously, we have to feed the world, but how do you tell the story? Why does this matter?
Well, I think how can you not tell the story, right? So if you're interested in the environment, agriculture has the biggest footprint of any industry. If you're concerned about human health, everybody eats. The connections between what you eat and your health, that nutritional component is completely interlinked. If you're interested in development, agriculture historically has a very important role in development. If you're interested in technology, it's wide open because we have been behind in agriculture in getting technology in the sector. And now it's just rolling at us from all sides. And it's clear that, like other sectors that, have embraced it more, that, that ag can be cool because now if you're out there on the farm, you're not, trapped in your combine or your planter staring straight ahead.
Exactly,
Now you're out there basically, it's filled by screens. Even if you're in the cab at all, it's filled by screens. You're basically on social media because everything's driving itself. You're playing with your drone and that drone's collecting serious information. You get back and it's really like you've got a dashboard with all of these things that you can control to control your crop. I mean, let's talk about all of these positive pieces.
Well, there is an experiential aspect to this and the excitement of technology. And it's a little different, but I took my 7 and 8-year-old daughters to the water reclamation or the water filtration and water plant Evanston. And after the tour, and it was a pretty good tour, I have to say. After the tour, I asked them what they thought, and my 7-year-old said, "It was really cool." And that's the kind of thing we have to get people, kids.
And maybe she'll be an engineer.
Maybe she'll be an engineer.
Because I was
She will either be an engineer or an artist, or both.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, you come by this all very honestly. You're from Kentucky originally, where we are today.
Completely.
Did you ever think you'd be on the floor of Rupp Arena?
I never didn't think that I would be. I guess I never saw barriers. I was very lucky growing up, I think. So I was an only child,
and your family business, it was a farm equipment?
Yeah, my dad had a farm equipment dealership, but both of my parents grew up in Kentucky been here for generations. I mean, back into the late 1700s.
Oh, wow.
It's, very, very deep that way, but both sides were too poor to ever own farmland. So they were always in agriculture, but, nobody could carry a farm, so there was no family farm.
Right.
So I grew up in, I was daddy's girl, and I would go with him as he was out working on equipment, or working. Neat. My summer job was working in the shop, and they always tried to put me in the office and say, "Here, you do the filing," which is what my mom did.
You said, "I'm not interested in files."
I hated it. So I wanted to be out, behind the parts counter, talking to these farmers that came in and doing that. So
that actually reminds me of my mother. She's of a different generation than you are, but she grew up in Iowa, and my grandfather took her down to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, when she turned 16 to get her license to drive a truck.
I was going to say she probably got a commercial.
A tank truck, a milk tank truck. And when she walked in, she got her license, and they said, "We think this is the first woman in the state of Iowa to get an actual license." That there were others who were driving trucks without licenses, but she had a license.
Wow.
And so that was pretty neat. So you have a background, many years at the Harvard Business School, a number of tours of duty with the Harvard Business School, a number of experiences in leadership roles in the private sector, even running a very interesting company for the Prince of Liechtenstein. How do these two things relate? You flow back and forth between these sectors, and there aren't that many people who do so.
Right. So I'm that failed PhD, right? That failed academic. It turned out was the best thing that ever happened.
By the way, Mary, PhD stands for fake doctor. So
completely.
It's probably a good thing that you
probably a good thing, right? So because it's I keep getting pulled back to industry. I like thoughts, and I like ideas, and I particularly like putting things together, trying to make connections between something you observe in this part of the industry and this part of the world, and say, why can't that be done someplace else? But yet maybe it's because I have a short attention span, I get bored easy, then I find myself, so you take in so much information, but then you need to go have and let some of it out.
So you want to do something with it.
But yet, unlike, here we're sitting in Kentucky, and, Dr. Pierce Lyons was such a great entrepreneur. I'm not entrepreneurial. Maybe I'm entrepreneurial with my career, but I'm not a risk taker. So
interesting.
I'm not the one that gets out and has the one idea and starts a business. I'm the person that likes lots of ideas, and I like helping you understand those ideas. I like helping, industry leaders understand those ideas. I like helping students and potential recruits to the industry understand those ideas.
Well, and this relates to your special position in the industry, which is more than most people. You look across the entire chain, all the way from pulling resources out of the ground to create fertilizer, for instance, all the way to the point where it's being consumed and disposed of in the consumer space. How does that affect your perspective on the world?
I think it's significant. That perspective for me came from Professor Ray Goldberg at Harvard Business School, and he's really the one that pulled me back into this sector, because I got my engineering degree. I was working for an oil company. I'd never even thought about being in this space. And when I was at Harvard doing my MBA, in the second year, there was an elective called Agribusiness. And I thought, well, maybe that'll be an easy class, right? I'll know something about it. I don't know what I want to do. I don't think it's
Professors
that. But
always
I'll just
love
take
hearing
it.
that.
Exactly. It'd be an easy class. I know something. And it turned out that this gentleman, who was old at the time, seemed old at the time, who's still active today and a lot older, was the father of agribusiness. He actually coined the term agribusiness, wrote a book in 1957 called The Concept of Agribusiness at Harvard Business School with a former assistant secretary of agriculture. And in 1961 started this a course for executives, which is what I ultimately worked.
Right. You ran that for a while.
Yeah, I ran that, came back to run that. So I was so attracted by what he did that I kept, that's that bridge, that going back and forth. It's nice to go back there, but then it's nice to be on the industry piece of it too. It was Professor Goldberg that actually introduced this idea in the 60s of a food chain or an agricultural chain. Today we would talk about it, right? Value chains, supply chains, common technology. At that time, nobody thought about it in the sector. And he was the first to really map it out and to measure the impact of it in the U.S. But from the very beginning, he always talked about the need that, kind of products flow down that chain, but the need for the information at the end of that chain at the consumer level to flow back up to the farmer. And that's what has historically been missing. And that's why, the farmer, would typically, you grow what you could grow locally. If you had something left over, you sell it into the market.
Yeah.
So it's a supply push rather than there's a consumer out there, a customer out there. This is what they want. Let me grow it for them, and they'll be willing to pay me a higher price for it.
So supply, demand matching data, weather data, planning, all of the technology required to produce what needs to be produced. What's the most exciting stuff going on these days across that chain from a technology perspective?
It's at every end. It's every possible sector. I think to me that the things that are the most exciting, most dramatic is the fact now that we're measuring everything. So as an engineer, I learned that if you measure it, you control it. Then you've learned how to control it because you have the information and you can improve it. You can figure out how to make it better over time. And if you don't, you're just kind of hit or miss, right? Particularly when you think about farming. And so you go through this process once a year, and then you come to the next year, and the next year is different. So you don't even get fast learning on it, if you get any learning. But now, because we can have, sensors on tractors and sensors on combines and weather data and quality data, and if you're milking cows, you get, data on the milk that's coming off of that specific cow at that specific time who's been, eating that specific diet. And with all of this big data and these, great new capabilities, we can start to find the relationships and understand what's really important in the system. And then we can start making better choices about how we manage that system.
Sure, and have greater transparency. So one of the technologies that's in the public dialogue right now, and we need a better public dialogue, is of course the conflict sometimes between organic and conventional farming, particularly around things like GMOs and genetic engineering. What's your perspective on that topic?
So I grew up, when I was in the seed industry, that was exactly when that entire, the technology came out and the negative public reaction started. And one of the things that I would point back to, there's been a lot of criticism of, the introducers of the technology, Monsanto in particular, and how they kind of, perceived as, pushed this, Roundup Ready soybeans into the market, down consumers' throats, not listening to anybody's. But, I think back about if we have the benefit now of hindsight, but if you were sitting there at Rob Shapiro's chair at the time, the CEO of Monsanto, and he told me one time we had to play the cards we were dealt. And they didn't know. It was a bunch of scientists extremely excited about what they had invented, had no idea how, widely it would be deployed. And they were just so proud of their work and, but not realizing that they were going into a marketplace that we already had too much. We had we were overproduction of crops. We were paying farmers not to produce. And if you look at the RBST space, another biotech product, RBST. So the bovine somatotrophin, the one that makes milk, cows produce more milk.
Okay.
Great idea, right? Now we'd say that's fantastic. You have a dairy cow that uses fewer resources to produce this, but at the time there was too much. So why do we want more? So the timing was a bit off. To me, the conversation's gotten, it was really colored by that early debate, whether it was pushback against Monsanto, whether it was, it's hard to see the true kind of scientific concerns about the technology because other than a few studies that have since been disproven, really no scientific, nothing but scientific support. And when I look at it and I tell my neighbors so I live in one of the suburbs of Boston, where this is not a commonly accepted idea, but the reason why we grow Roundup Ready soybeans on my farm is because of the great environmental savings that once I go through that with them, they're much more respectful. When I say this means that we don't have to plant, fence row to fence row, we can save those set aside lands. We can not make a pass through the field with as many, with the tractor as many times because we don't have to plow. That it's basically, so I call it soybeans, Roundup Ready soybeans, farming for dummies. Because when my dad was farming, and he was one of the first people in the United States to work on no-till farming. It was really incredible. Kentucky was
that's a risk too. That's a risk to try something new when your margins are so thin.
And this was the 1960s. I mean, nobody was talking about this at the time. Conservation tillage, so early adoption. He said, "Man, corn is easy. Soybeans are really difficult because we've got all these weeds that come at different times that can completely take it over." And then once you had Roundup Ready soybeans, it was really easy to do that. So I think that, not the benefits that are relevant now are different than the needs that were in the marketplace at the time.
What do you mean the benefits that are relevant now are different than the needs that in the market at the time?
Well,
what do you mean?
Well, it goes into this idea that at that point we were at a time of surplus. We already had too much. We weren't thinking about the fact that we were going to have this great growth in global demand for these products.
Exports skyrocketed.
That's right. Exports skyrocketed. If you look today, much more awareness of the constraints in terms of land and water and the fact that we don't want to plow under the rainforest in Brazil, or we don't want to cut down the palm trees in Indonesia, that we really want to contain agriculture's footprint. And to do that, we need to have access to technologies that allow us to do more with less. So
it does seem like there's a lack of systemic view when people are arguing about these topics. And if I decide not to do this, then it might have a very negative impact over here. But how do we improve this dialogue? Because my perspective, I've, as a novice, read some of the studies, a number of the studies. I am comfortable enough with genetically modified organisms. My family consumes them. We also consume some organic product too, where we believe those are higher quality, better experience. But there's this near the twain shall meet approach in the marketplace. It's very divisive. How do you get people over this notion? And a follow-up, let's start there, but a follow-up will be, remember science told us asbestos would be a great thing back 40, 50 years ago. How do you navigate that longer-term risk?
Yeah, so that's that European, kind of precautionary principle. You can't accept anything new until you have 100 years of data that it's not.
It's not new anymore.
But in that case, we'd never have any progress, right? I mean, horses would kill you, automobiles will kill you, probably flying around on, spaceships will kill you too, or Elon Musk's hyperlinks will kill you, So I won't say that it's hard to eliminate every risk in the system, but to me, given what is happening on that genetic manipulation side, the way that we came up with all these other varieties that have been very successful, the majority of what we consume now and have consumed since the 1930s is, you get the diversity that goes and makes a cross through a process called mutagenesis. Basically, you take acid and put it on the seeds and get genetic differences. It's so random, right? And nobody has pushed back against that.
And now
We're
we have
here. It's much
ability,
more
targeted,
yeah, much more targeted,
controllable.
And again, kind of, great benefits for the environment. And on the other side of it, the known even now after what, so introduced in 1996. So, 22 years, and there's never been a case of a human health incident related to the technology. So, it's a lot of time. I spend a lot of time in Europe, and there I'm always amazed because there was a much stronger reaction.
Much stronger
than there was here, but yet.
But also, Mary, the reactions in general against technology industry, not just agriculture. I mean, I know 6 or 7 years ago was there, and already the level of distrust against a Google or a Facebook, or for that matter later Alibaba, was very high. So it seems to be there's a cultural adaptation to that as well.
But yet everybody has a cell phone, or 2 or 3 or 10, and a laptop, and other forms of technology.
So what can we learn about how this has evolved so far, and how can we make the dialogue better?
So I think
still rigorous and challenging.
The one piece of it, I think, that was a big mistake on the side of the technology inventors, and it took a long time to come to this realization, is that people don't want to be educated about this by an expert. They need to, it's an emotional issue, and facts in that case, it seems like, will never trump emotions. So I think, to me, one of the the ways forward that we're getting better at those conversations is to help people first understand what the challenges and the opportunities are, and then to present a technology as a way to solve a problem. Rather than just like, wow, here's something that's new and shiny.
So lead with the challenges and establish the meaning of the challenge, and then say, and here's technology
that's going to help. But yet we do also know that leading with the challenge of, we need to feed the world, is not the right challenge to lead with either. That one doesn't seem to be resonant when you really get down at the consumer level, because whether it's a not in my backyard syndrome, we see now in some countries that have had very strong agricultural programs, even some pushback against those programs in terms of saying, wait a minute, what's the benefit? Why should my country, we're exporting this product, why should my country bear the environmental costs associated with providing milk to China, or cheese to China? So it's very, very complex. Emotions are involved, livelihoods are involved, lifestyles are involved.
So what's a story you've seen that works regarding a challenge that captures people's attention, is meaningful to them?
So again, I've had some success in engaging with my neighbors to explain, why I personally, have, I won't say embraced warmly, but certainly accepted that, the technology growing biotech seeds on, my farm here in Kentucky is the right thing to do, because I think it has a better environmental impact because of it. I think it's more sustainable. We're nicer to the soil. We don't have compaction by the tractor tires that run across the fields. We're not ripping it up with a plow and having nutrients wash away and topsoil wash away. And when you can tell that personal story, people will pay a lot more attention to it. And I think farmers are still, quite respected by the public, but big farming is not. Maybe the practices of farming are less respected. One of the cool things that I think that's happening now, as farming is getting more technified, I think it's becoming cooler in the U.S. to, especially with this younger population that likes technology, they're pro-technology, and suddenly it's fine to be out there, with this tractor with all of these instrument panels, and it's like playing a video game, and it takes.
Well, I think your point about solving a problem, a meaningful problem, and then also the millennial generation and the Gen Yers coming up behind them, Gen Zers coming
Yeah.
up behind them. You can bring those two things together around agriculture, and I think we need that to happen. But let's come back to GMO just for a second.
Okay.
I'm on board with the science, and I feel very comfortable consuming it. But there are other issues. Like, do farmers risk becoming dependent on these potentially very expensive tools, the seeds, or is that not a non-issue?
I just think it's a non-issue, right? Farmers are really smart. They might not have the book learning. My dad didn't graduate high school, but he was really sharp. He knew how to make things work. He knew what made sense financially. And every place I go around the world, farmers are basically very entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
If something is profitable, they will use it. If it's not profitable, they won't. It's silly to think that, we've got them wrapped up into this system. It's not like they're hooked on this drug that, like the opioid crisis, to where you can't walk away. They can walk away. They can do another system. They don't have to, to pursue that. There's other opportunities, other things to do with the land, or they can, fall away or, go away to do something else. So I don't buy that at all. I think the economics have to work out. I think that there's sometimes an information asymmetry that, the seed companies or the crop input companies, have more information than the farmer has. And I think technology, though, will help us balance that.
Yeah. So you've spent time all over the world with the ag industry in your career. Where are the most exciting things going on that you're seeing these days?
Well, one of the things that program that I'm particularly excited about is what's been happening in Ireland. In 2012, they introduced a national sustainability program. And as far as I know, it's still the only one in the world. And it was very ambitious.
This was Origin Green.
Origin Green, it's called. And it was very ambitious because the goal was set in 2012 to have 100% of Irish food and drink exports go out by 2016 from basically a country that was verified sustainable producer. Mm-hmm. And Ireland, you might think it's small, but it's, it is a major supplier in the world of dairy, and it's a major supplier of beef, and there's other products as well. But what they are is they're very high cost, right? Because it's fragmented, it's small, but it's also kind of has a historic base of being, at least green and having a lot of water.
Right, physically green. But Mary, I want to underscore the fact that, first of all, you were directly involved in helping to build that approach, this Origin Green notion. And second, so I'd love to hear more about it, but second, this initiative started, you got moving with this in 2010.
That's correct.
In 2010, it's tough to recall this, but the global financial system had melted down.
Yes.
And few countries in the world faced more of the trauma than Ireland. And just to make a plug for Ireland, I took a whole group there last year. And it is extraordinary the decisions that the Irish people made, that the government made, to stick to their commitments, to plow through and figure this out, and they have. And so partly due to your work and the team that built Origin Green, and I think it's called Pathways for Growth.
Pathways for Growth.
And then the rise in medical devices and other
and a
industries.
general investment in education, I think, so that continuing to be.
The talent issue.
The talent.
So tell us about Origin Green and how it's, that was an audacious thing to say in 2012. Really, 4 years later, how do we have an entire industry that is sustainable, verifiably sustainable? How did that go?
It's just, I think what it was is that, my role in it and my colleagues' role is that we were invited across by the Irish government in 2010. And that was basically the Celtic Tiger had collapsed. Right. You had tremendous unemployment. Interest rates were, the whole bank lending system, loans were being called. People had bought properties at very high values.
Entire plants were being closed in the tech space, for instance.
Right. And then at the same time, you had, kind of a shift in the currencies between the euro and the pound. And so British exports were flooding into the Irish market in the food sector. So it was a very, very difficult time. But it was particularly unemployment because these major industries had shut their doors. And my colleague and I, we're given a specific charge. How do we increase the export growth for our agri-food industry? And we did this very simple thing. We talked to a few people, right? And then basically we stepped up and we said, and those few people included all the CEOs of all the Irish food companies, and who were tremendously giving of their time, because this was a problem, even if they were major exporters. And to us, it was pretty simple. It was like, look, everything here is too small. It's a very fragmented industry. Your costs are too high, and part of that's because you have no scale, but also you're an island. Your costs are high because you have to bring in inputs.
Right.
You have no brands. You're not in touch with
The
the
lower
consumers.
value
Everything is
add.
B2B.
Yeah.
It's got has this commodity orientation. So you have Guinness, and you have Bailey's Irish Cream, and you have Bailey's Irish whiskey, right? Bailey's Irish Cream. So the few brands you have are really these spirits brands, but you have no food brands.
Right.
Even though you're a food producer, you're B2B, and you're like producing commodities, and you're not going to be the lowest
But now
cost.
I think we're aware of like Kerrygold. And
Kerrygold. So
did that come out?
that
of
actually came out of this, as we were
Great.
talking about what in the world could we do.
Yeah.
But and so we had a very simple thing. We said, first of all, you guys need to work together. You can't be fighting with each other. If you have two beef suppliers out calling on a German retailer, don't compete the price down. This is just silly, right? You're too small. We accused Ireland of being a rounding error for Nestle, because Irish food exports in 2009 were 7 billion euros, and Nestle's sales at that year were about 100 billion Swiss francs. So it was
Wow.
you guys get over it. And then we said, and you have to differentiate. You're never going to be low cost, so you have to differentiate. We need to pull up the ag sector in terms of better practices, better talent, better ideas, and by the way, it seems like the world is looking for more food. They care now more about where food's produced,
more authenticity,
and
too.
more authenticity.
And Ireland can bring authenticity,
and they can bring authenticity. You're right here next to Europe, where they're looking for this, but to do it, to go out with a claim around being natural, you have to. It has to be something more than a marketing claim. You have to be able to prove it.
Right.
And that was really the putting that together, led after 2 years of research by this group called Board BA, the Irish Food Board, to the introduction, the creation of Origin Green, not just as a brand, but as a program, a very, very complex program that went across the chain, completely commercially focused.
I visited Port Vila last year in Dublin and took a group to Ireland, and I can tell you, Mary, they're singing from that hymnal today.
Super,
and
isn't it?
we visited the location where it's not just here we're sustainable and telling the story. This was a part of Port Vila that was helping the ag sector tell their stories, to create stories.
So you were in the thinking house.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. Creating brand concepts and making them real, and packaging innovation and all these
And getting
things.
closer to the consumer. It's
Yeah.
and so that idea about, developing brands based on what consumers and customers actually want.
So that has mostly developed between 2010 and today,
Completely.
just 8 years.
Completely.
Very, very impressive. When you can bring an industry and an ecosystem of people together
Yes.
around a challenge. Maybe that had something to do with the fact that things were so difficult.
Never lose the opportunity provided by a good crisis.
Right. Yeah.
So it's interesting to think. I've talked to other countries around the world, other states here in the U.S. about doing this type of program, and unless your back is against the wall, there's a lot of reasons why you can't do it. But it was just tremendously well executed. How we're going to roll this out to industry. Who's going to go on stage first and stand up and be the champion for it at an industry level? So this had to make sense for the big companies like the Glanbias and the Kerrys, the multinationals, the Irish distillers,
Right.
as much as it made sense for the small, food producer. And these big guys had their own, big successful businesses to run. And so those were engaged, government was engaged. So we were very fortunate that the agricultural minister at the time, Simon Coveney, who's now the deputy prime minister, he's a passionate speaker, and he loved his program. He came from the agriculture, so he was out the evangelist for it, both in the world and at home, explaining what everybody needed to get on board with this program.
Well, if there's one asset that Ireland should have lots of, that's great storytellers.
It is.
So
that helps.
And you leveraged it well. So in your years in the ag space, both in academia, private sector, what's something that has most surprised you? Something unexpected, and what can we learn from that?
I think, since I like to follow the whole chain, from the farm to fork piece of it, or, fork to farm, I think the biggest surprise to all of us was, last year in June, whenever Amazon bought Whole Foods. That was just completely unexpected.
So that was off the radar
completely off the radar. I'd just given a talk on, the future of retailing at this conference here, 3 weeks before. And in hindsight, again, it was clear it should have been going in that direction. We talked about, the fact that, millennials, they hate to go to supermarkets. I think it's a complete waste of time. They don't want to, they don't get joy out of, walking up and down the aisles. They like to have things online. So it shouldn't have been any surprise at all. So that's one surprise.
Well, to your defense and everybody else in the industry, the financial markets were surprised too. You saw the rapid decline in minutes after the announcement of all the grocers.
Completely.
But I tell this to people I work with across industries, that it's not just Amazon, it's Google and everybody. They're all circling, looking for other places to create value, to compete. And Amazon, Jeff Bezos is quite clear. I'm going to provide anything I can to customers the fastest and best way I possibly can do it. And if that's grocery, it's going to be grocery. It was brilliant. So what can we learn from that blind side?
Well, one, I think probably the most important thing is you always think it won't happen to you. And, probably the taxi industry said the same thing, and the hotel industry said the same thing, and the movie rental store industry said the same thing. It's
and by the way, Mary, remember in the late 90s when the internet or the web was first booming, people would say things like, well, of course they can sell books online because you know what you're getting, but nobody's ever going to buy, I don't know, shoes online.
Right.
Because you have to try them on.
Yeah, I
and
know, and it's the best thing, because you can try them on. It's fantastic.
Right, isn't it?
So that piece of it. So that piece of it. But I think the other element that runs in there, which is another thing that perhaps even more profoundly surprises me, but also pleases me, is this millennial story. And I think they get, there's a lot of conversations about millennials. If you talk to a lot of people, you get a lot of.
What's your perspective?
I think they're amazing, right? It's one. I'm the parent of one, so that's so my data source of one, or one and his friends, and now fiance. So that's also another exciting thing. He's very unmillennial in the fact that he's probably going to get married. Is going to get married before he, at 26 years old, which is not typical there, but. I think they're great because they are thoughtful. They do consider purpose. They consider, quality of life, which is, perhaps more important than we give credit for. I mean, I think perhaps, I know my generation, probably yours as well, it's like, work the 80-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks, 120-hour weeks, and they're saying, no, we push back. That's not good for us. And I think they're right. It's not good for them. It's tough for business, but it's not good for them. But the thing that I really like about them is they're so much more thoughtful about what they're eating. They, pay more attention to nutrition. They're conscious about where things come from. They want to engage in cooking. They might not know how to do it, but they want to engage in cooking, and they're interested. They like diverse things. They've been described as, food thrill seekers.
Right. Well, this has a lot to do with the experience economy, the fact that there's an increased value on new, novel experiences, and also, as we mentioned, authenticity, something that has something real underneath it, whatever real means.
Right, and real is probably some kind of story.
Yes.
because it doesn't have to be real in the sense that, oh, it's transparent, it's traceable. The
Right.
thing that's probably the most surprised me over time, it hasn't surprised me, but it's that people in the industry, the food industry, I think that, oh, it's about traceability. We just need to be able to show them the supply chain. And so blockchain is going to solve all our problems because the supply chain is going to be fully traceable. I don't think it's about traceability at all. I think it's about you want to be sure about your food, but do you really care, what the steps were? You look at the craft beer industry, you look at the specialty coffee industry, the ones that have really been successful about telling a great story,
Yeah.
getting in. So you have Providence and coffee, right? But yet nobody's saying, show me.
Show me which ship it was on.
Right.
Right.
And craft beer, it's just like, wow, it's local. Right. That's cool, right? But
Yeah,
who knows what those ingredients?
This is a really interesting example because if you think about a lot of craft beer, I'll pick on that.
Yeah.
A couple of investment bankers in New York get tired of being investment bankers. They start making some beer and they said, screw investment banking. I'm going to go make some craft beer in upstate New York. And that's a story. I'm going to change my life, quality of life. That's a story. Now, if you look underneath, how authentic really is it that a couple of investment bankers from Manhattan decided to make craft beer? But it's not about necessarily a 1,000-year heritage. It's about the human story.
Completely.
What's the human story? So, Mary, what's the human story 20 years from now? Where is agriculture and humanity 20 years from now?
Well, I certainly hope it's more engaged with each other, that humanity is more engaged with agriculture.
But how do we do that when we're just disconnected from it, and it seems like we become even more through technology disconnected?
We are disconnected, but yet can we connect even more through that technology? You think now about the rise in the city gardens, the urban gardens, the inside gardens, the outside gardens, more around engagement. I think we're just as what I see over time, we've become much more thoughtful about system thinking and especially how we use our spaces. So, terrible story, right? Funny story to tell. Harvard Business School, when I was there, they rebuilt the faculty office building. And they built it, they kept the outside facade, but they made the inside beautiful. And in the middle of it, they built it kind of all around the outside. And in the middle, they put in this area, big open area, and they found an old mosaic, huge, over in one of the Harvard Art Museums. And they put that in the middle, and they made a water feature around it, so it's gorgeous to look at. And it turned out, though, what happened is you have this thing in the middle, you can't walk on it. It's walled off. They had to wall it off because people were falling off into the water next to it. Mm-hmm. And so people don't congregate because there's no space. Now when we think about designing spaces, we think about, wow, how do you get people come together?
Space for congregation.
How do you get people to interact? How do you make them want to stay longer? Why does Google feed everybody, right? It's because they don't want them to go home. And I think we're going to do that with agriculture. How to get, more of the population to engage with it? I just visited a company that does green walls. So these installations they can be outside, they can be inside.
By the way, every time I see one of those, invariably someone walking by stares at it or says, "Hey, look at that." Right.
And it's it's even as simple as that, right? So then you're around something that's living, and you recognize that those plants don't always live all the time.
So what about urban farming and vertical farming and all? What, from a business perspective, what impact might vertical farming have in the next decade, say?
In the next decade, I think it's still expensive. I think, if you put them close to the city, it's expensive land, it's expensive labor, so they have to be highly automated. So we're clearly working the kinks out. They might work for some things, but are we going to feed a city fresh produce grown in urban farms in the perimeter there? No, there's just no way. You think of a city like Shanghai, 26 million people. It's mind-boggling. So can they supplement the system, the system that we use to supply fresh food perhaps, but I think it's really hard to compete.
Maybe specialized
Specialized
varieties of
the
various
ones that I
things.
know that start out trying to grow everything inside because it's basically wanting to replicate an outside garden, and they say, oh, we wanted to, because we want to supply a basket to consumers, very quickly start down the path of, well, wait a minute, tomatoes don't grow in the same environment as mushrooms or strawberries.
Right.
And so suddenly you see this move towards specialization of areas, which is, what
It looks like
which
traditional.
starts to look traditional. So I think they're interesting.
Yeah.
I particularly like the ones now that are containerized.
Yes.
So you can drop them in. They're modular. You don't have to make that whole big investment at once.
Yeah.
And as demand grows, you can just replicate.
Literally
them.
farm in a box.
Literally farm in a box.
This Kimball Musk, Elon Musk's brother, has been very much involved in trying to bring food closer to human beings and schools, and has these modular gardens that they can move into the schools. That kind of farm in a container could be part of that solution to bring it, make it more tangible and direct,
and to give young people more of a way to engage with it. So, and you think about it, you're bringing in a lot of things, right? It's not just the farm you're bringing in. You're bringing in technology. You're bringing in economics.
Mm-hmm.
You're bringing in,
entrepreneurship potential.
Yeah, entrepreneurship. So many things. If you build a curriculum around that, this is why I like these ideas. If you can integrate all that, I think you can engage. We're so concerned about, attracting, youth into STEM careers, but we never show them, I think, how they're actually really relevant. Stick them in math classes that it's like, well, how am I ever going to use this? Where if you can put them in something to where they actually use it because it's important,
right, then
it can really pique that curiosity.
So what concerns you most about the whole food ag space looking the next 20 years or so? What most concerns you?
Well, I'm an optimistic person by nature, but I'm pragmatic as well. I think the thing that really concerns me is the contentiousness of the debate.
Yeah.
The debate around technology, the debate around, almost like values-based food, is organic, is it so superior, not just because I'm rejecting technology, but because I hold this set of values.
Yeah.
Whether it's, I'm vegetarian because I hold these values. I don't think animals should be used for food production.
Right.
And
which you can hold that view,
right,
but not be contentious and not be be counterproductive.
Right, and in particular, not make someone that's in a very different, economic situation feel guilty about the choices they're making. Yeah. And I see that the biggest challenge of the food for one or the 1% or the 2% is that I'm all for figuring out ways to get consumers to pay premium for things. I think that's a great thing, right? That's what our entire it's all built on.
Business is about.
It completely, it's what business is about. Get somebody to pay more for than especially the cost.
Right.
But when you start then saying, if you don't eat this, you're a poor mother.
Yeah.
You're putting your children at risk.
There's a holier than thou aspect to it that is counterproductive.
Right, it's counterproductive. So I look at some of the legislation, Massachusetts recently, vote on, like cage-free eggs or something, and it's, it just doesn't support it. So you have, most of the, the population is fine, paying an extra, however much it is for a carton of eggs, but there are people that can't.
Yeah.
And that's a protein, that egg is a protein, a very good protein at a very low price.
Yeah.
Now, have you pushed them to eat something else that's not a good protein?
Right. Because
you priced it out of the market.
Yeah. So how do we improve the health, the wellness, and the equity within the food system, as opposed to just assuming that we're going to mandate it? Yeah. Great. So your son's getting married.
He is.
And he's what's his career path right now?
So he was very traditional in some respects. He was a graduated from Vanderbilt, which was
Great.
fantastic,
Yep.
close to here. So
My mother lived
close
in
to home.
Tennessee.
Yep. So there, it was a great school for him. Grew up in Boston, but he's a Southern boy, which makes a Southern mother proud. So that's a good thing. And he graduated with a degree in economics and something called human and organizational development. So it put two very interesting, a numbers
Yes.
approach with a more of a how people make decisions, how companies make decisions. So then he went and worked for a strategy consulting firm for almost 4 years, and now has left there though within the last 3 months. And as of this summer, he's going to go to work in my husband's company, who has a small, basically a tech startup.
Oh, wow.
So he was always entrepreneurial. My son, he knew he wanted to do this, but he chose to get his quote MBA in the real world by being paid for it in consulting, and then getting a little money in the bank, and now being able to take this risk, this entrepreneurial risk.
Well, that's great. So your son will be taking an entrepreneurial risk in a pragmatic way.
Yes, in a pragmatic way.
And as you said near the beginning, you're not a risk taker. You know thyself, but you like to enable other people to do it. It seems you've done that, at least with a sample set of one.
Complete. I hope that's the case. I hope there's been others too.
So we're coming down to the end of our conversation. Hopefully not our last conversation. But what is your perspective about the future? How do you feel about the future? 3 words to describe how you feel about the future, and hyphens are acceptable. 3 words to describe how you feel about the future, and hyphens are acceptable.
Oh, geez, that's tough. Well, number 1's optimistic. Excited is number 2, and happy to be a part of it. I think this is again, it goes back to this is the most exciting time to be in this industry.
It is in so many ways, Mary, one of the most exciting times to be alive. Of course, neither one of us has context for any of the other times.
Right, that's true.
But certainly the challenges and the opportunities to solve them we have are extraordinary. How can you not tell this story? How do we reposition the sector? How do we find the right people, get the right people into this area? And if we have these grand challenges, if we bring the right people to bear, we'll be able to figure it out. It's an emotional issue. I also learned from you that millennials are amazing. And it's great to hear that. I have a similar perspective. I am getting old enough to roll my eyes sometimes, but generally I'm also inspired by them. The quality of life, the human story, these are things that are becoming essential. Mary Shelman, thank you so much for being part of our journey.
Thank you.